The banker's letter trembled in Ethan Cole's calloused hands. 30 days until foreclosure. 30 days until everything his father built turned to dust. He'd gambled everything on a mail-order bride, a desperate man's last play for survival. Now, watching her step off that stagecoach in a dress worth more than his best horse, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. This elegant Eastern woman would take one look at his failing ranch and run. But when Lillian Moore's eyes met his across that dusty Nebraska street, she didn't flinch. She smiled. And Ethan Cole's world shifted on its axis. Before we dive into this story of desperation, deception, and unexpected salvation, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. The August heat pressed down on Sterling Creek like a hand crushing the life from the land. Ethan Cole stood on the weathered planks of the train platform, his Sunday shirt sticking to his back, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that matched the approaching stagecoach. In his coat pocket, the banker's letter felt like it weighed 10 pounds, though it was just a single sheet of paper with words that spelled the end of everything. 30 days. He'd read it so many times in the past week that he could recite it from memory. Dear Mr. Cole, this letter serves as formal notice that unless payment of $847 received by September 15, 1872, the First Bank of Sterling Creek will commence foreclosure proceedings on the property known as Cole Ranch. $847. It might as well have been $8,000. After 3 years of drought, sick cattle, and crop failures, Ethan barely had $80 to his name. The ranch that had been in his family for 20 years, the land his father had died defending during the war, the soil his mother had watered with her tears before consumption took her last winter, all of it would be gone. Sold at auction to pay debts he couldn't escape. The stagecoach rattled into view, dust billowing behind it like a brown storm cloud. Ethan's stomach clenched. This was it, his last desperate gamble, a mail-order bride. The idea had come to him 3 months ago, in the darkest part of a sleepless night. He'd been staring at the ceiling of his empty house, listening to the wind rattle the loose shingles he couldn't afford to fix, when he remembered old Samuel Morrison's story. Samuel had been in the same position 15 years back, drowning in debt, losing hope, until he'd sent for a mail-order bride from Philadelphia. She'd brought a small dowry, enough to keep the bank at bay. They'd built something together. It had worked. It was a slim chance, a desperate man's fantasy, but Ethan had nothing else. He'd scraped together $12 for the advertisement in the Boston matrimonial paper. Hardworking rancher 28 seeks capable wife for partnership in Nebraska territory. Modest but honest home. Opportunity for determined woman. He'd been honest in his letters to Lillian Moore, brutally so. He'd told her the ranch was struggling. He'd told her life would be hard. He'd told her he needed help, not just a wife to cook and clean, but a true partner who could work beside him. He'd promised her nothing but honesty, hard work, and a chance to build something real. Her letters back had been unexpected, educated, thoughtful, with handwriting so elegant it looked like art. She'd asked strange questions too, about water access, about crop rotation, about whether he kept accounts. He'd answered as best he could, confused but grateful that anyone had responded at all. In her last letter, she'd agreed to come. No dowry mentioned, which had disappointed him, but she'd said something that stuck in his mind. I'm not seeking comfort, Mr. Cole. I'm seeking purpose. The stagecoach jerked to a halt in front of the platform, and Ethan's mouth went dry. Around him, the usual crowd had gathered. Old Tom Harrison from the feed store, the Sutton brothers waiting for supply shipments, Betty Franklin and her daughter Mary, who never missed the stagecoach arrival because it was the most exciting thing that happened all week in Sterling Creek. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd been running this route for 20 years, climbed down and opened the door. Lady for Mr. Cole, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ethan stepped forward, his boots feeling like they were filled with lead. This was the moment. This was when his desperate plan would either give him hope or confirm his complete stupidity. A gloved hand appeared first, gripping the edge of the stagecoach door. Then a shoe. A real leather shoe with a small heel, not the practical boots frontier women wore. Ethan's heart sank. Then she stepped down, and every thought in his head scattered like dust in wind. Lillian Moore was nothing like he'd imagined. The photograph she'd sent had been a small, blurry thing, barely showing her features. He'd pictured someone plain, practical, maybe a bit worn down by life. The kind of woman desperate enough to travel 1,500 miles to marry a stranger. The woman standing before him was anything but plain. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in an intricate style that must have taken an hour to arrange. Her dress was deep green, not fancy by Eastern standards, he supposed, but finer than anything he'd seen in Sterling Creek for years. It fit her perfectly, emphasizing a figure that was neither too thin nor too plump, but elegant in a way that spoke of breeding and privilege. Her face was striking, strong cheekbones, a determined jaw, eyes so dark they were almost black, and lips pressed together in an expression of assessment. That's what it was. She wasn't nervous or frightened or overwhelmed. She was studying everything with the focused intensity of a surveyor mapping new land. She looked like she belonged at a Boston society party, not on a dust-choked platform in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. Behind him, Ethan heard Mary Franklin whisper loudly, "Mercy! She looks like she stepped out of a magazine." Pete hauled down a surprisingly modest trunk and a single carpet bag. "All her luggage," he said, giving Ethan a significant look. A woman traveling light was either desperate or practical. Ethan couldn't figure out which. Lillian Moore turned those dark eyes on him, and Ethan felt like he was being weighed and measured and found wanting all in the span of a heartbeat. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice was low, controlled, with a crisp Eastern accent that made his rough frontier speech sound even cruder in his own mind. "Yes, ma'am." He pulled off his hat, suddenly aware of how he must look to her. Sunburned, work-roughened, wearing a shirt with a patch on the elbow that his late mother had sewn. "Miss Moore, welcome to Sterling Creek." She stepped forward and extended her hand. Not for him to kiss, which would have been ridiculous anyway, but for a handshake, like a business partner. Surprised, Ethan took it. Her grip was firm, her hand small, but not weak. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Cole." Her eyes swept past him to the assembled townspeople who were watching with unabashed curiosity, then to the town itself, a single street of weathered buildings baking in the August sun. Something flickered in her expression, but it wasn't disappointment. It was more like calculation. "I trust the journey into your ranch isn't too far? The last 3 days of travel have been rather taxing." "About an hour by wagon," Ethan managed. His prepared speech had evaporated from his mind. He'd meant to say something welcoming, something to put her at ease, but all he could think was that this was a disaster. This elegant, educated woman would take one look at his failing ranch and demand to be put on the next stagecoach back east. "Excellent." She turned to Pete. "Thank you for your assistance, driver." Pete tipped his hat, grinning. "Pleasure, ma'am. Good luck to you both." The words hung in the air like a prophecy. They'd need more than luck. Ethan hoisted her trunk onto his shoulder. It wasn't as heavy as he'd expected, and grabbed the carpet bag. "Wagons this way!" As they walked past the gawking crowd, Ethan heard the whispers start. "She's too fine for him. Won't last a month. Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." Each word was a knife between his ribs, but he kept walking. Betty Franklin called out, "Welcome to Sterling Creek, dear," with forced cheerfulness that only made things worse. Lillian nodded graciously, but didn't stop. She walked beside Ethan with perfect posture, her chin up, seemingly unbothered by the stares and whispers. When they reached his wagon, a battered farm wagon with one wheel that wobbled and paint peeling from the boards, she regarded it with the same calm assessment she'd given everything else. "This is it," Ethan said, and hated how defeated he sounded. "I apologize. It's not fancy." "It has 4 wheels and a team of horses," Lillian said practically. "That's more than I had 3 days ago." She looked at the wagon bed. "Should I sit in back with the trunk?" "No." The word came out too loud. Ethan cleared his throat. "No, ma'am. You sit up front. With me." He loaded her trunk while she stood waiting, and then offered his hand to help her up. She took it, climbing onto the bench seat with surprising grace given her dress. When Ethan settled beside her and took up the reins, he was acutely aware of her presence, the faint scent of lavender soap, the rustle of her dress, The way she sat with her hands folded in her lap like she was in a church pew instead of a farm wagon. The horses started forward, and Sterling Creek began to fall behind them. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. Ethan's mind raced, trying to figure out what to say, how to begin explaining the disaster she'd walked into. Finally, Lillian broke the silence. "Mr. Cole, I've found that difficult conversations are best had directly. Don't you agree?" Ethan glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead, her profile sharp against the pale sky. "Yes, ma'am, I do." "Then let's be direct." She turned to face him, and those dark eyes were unflinching. "Your letters were honest about the ranch's difficulties, but I suspect they may have been optimistic in their assessment. Am I correct?" The knot in Ethan's stomach tightened. "Yes. How bad is it?" He could lie. He could hedge. He could try to buy himself a few days before she discovered the truth. But she'd asked for directness, and he'd promised her honesty from the start. "Bad," he said flatly. "Worse than I wrote. The bank's calling in the loan. I have 30 days to come up with $847, or they'll foreclose." Lillian's expression didn't change. "Do you have $847? "No." "How much do you have?" "About $80. Maybe 90 if I sell my good saddle." "I see." She looked back at the road ahead. "And you invited me here hoping I might bring a dowry that could save you." It sounded so mercenary when she said it like that. Yes. That was part of it, but not all of it. I need help, Miss Moore. Real help. This ranch, it's all I have left of my family. My father built it from nothing. He died defending this territory. My mother held it together through the war and after, until the sickness took her last winter. I've been trying to keep it going alone, but His voice cracked, and he stopped, furious at himself. "But you can't," Lillian finished quietly. "One man can't do the work of three, no matter how hard he tries." "No." The admission tasted like failure. "I can't." They rode in silence for a while. The prairie stretched out around them, brown grass rippling in the hot wind. In the distance, a hawk circled, hunting. Ethan waited for her to demand he turn around, to take her back to town and put her on the next stagecoach east. Instead, she asked, "How many acres?" He blinked. "What?" "Your ranch. How many acres?" 320. "Water access?" "Miller's Creek runs through the north section, a well near the house." "Livestock?" 23 head of cattle, 6 horses, some chickens." "Crops?" "Wheat mostly, some corn. There's an old apple orchard, but it's not been maintained in years." Lillian nodded slowly, as if filing away each answer. "Buildings?" "Main house. Barn. 2 outbuildings that need repair. Some fencing that's falling down." "The house. How many rooms?" 4, sitting room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, plus a root cellar." "You live there alone?" "Yes." Another long silence. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. "Just ask," he thought. "Just ask whatever you're working up to." "Mr. Cole," Lillian said finally, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." She took a breath, and for the first time, he saw something like nervousness cross her face. "I don't have a dowry. I have $47 to my name, the clothes in that trunk, and my father's account books. That's all." Ethan's last hope crumbled to dust. $47 wouldn't even make a dent in what he owed. "My father was Nathaniel Moore," Lillian continued. "He was a business consultant in Boston, successful, respected. He advised merchants and small manufacturers, helped them organize their finances and operations. He taught me everything: accounting, analysis, resource management. I kept his books from the time I was 16. She paused, her jaw tightening. 3 years ago, one of his clients was accused of fraud. My father had managed his accounts. There was an investigation. My father was never charged with any crime. They found no evidence he'd known about the fraud. But the association was enough. His reputation was destroyed. Clients abandoned him. Society turned its back on us. He died 2 years ago, broken and bitter. My mother died 6 months after him. I've been living on charity from distant relatives who made it clear I was a burden they no longer wished to carry. She turned to look at Ethan directly. I can't bring you money, Mr. Cole, but I can bring you skills. I know how to read accounts, how to find waste, how to maximize limited resources. I know how to plan, organize, and execute strategy. I've done it my entire adult life. Her voice dropped, becoming almost fierce. I didn't come to Nebraska for comfort or security. I came because your letters suggested you needed a partner, not just a wife. I came because I need to prove to myself more than anyone that my skills have value, that my father's teaching wasn't wasted, that I can build something real and lasting, even if I have to do it 1,500 miles from where I started. The wagon rattled on. A gust of wind sent dust swirling across the road. Ethan's mind spun, trying to process what she'd just told him. She had no money, but she had skills, business skills, the kind he'd never had, the kind that might actually matter. I need you to be honest with me, Mr. Cole, Lillian said quietly. Given what I've just told you, do you still want me to stay? Or would you prefer to turn around and take me back to town? It was a fair question, a reasonable question. She was offering him an out, a chance to end this before it went any further. Ethan thought about his empty house, the account books he could barely understand, the land that was slipping through his fingers no matter how hard he worked. He thought about the 30 days until foreclosure. He thought about the way she'd studied everything with those sharp, assessing eyes. He thought about her words. I can build something real and lasting. I want you to stay, he heard himself say. I want you to stay and I want your help. He swallowed hard. I want to know if you really think you can make a difference. Because I'll be honest with you, Miss Moore, I'm out of options. I'm out of time. I don't know if anyone can save this ranch at this point, but if you're willing to try, then I'll work harder than I've ever worked in my life to help you do it. Lillian's expression softened just slightly. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Cole. A partnership. We'll try to save your ranch together. Even though we're getting married tomorrow? The words felt strange in his mouth. Marriage. To this stranger who looked like she belonged in a different world entirely. Especially because we're getting married tomorrow, Lillian said firmly. A true partnership requires commitment and trust. Marriage will be the foundation. Everything else, we'll build as we go. She extended her hand again, and this time when Ethan shook it, it felt like sealing a pact. A bargain made in desperation, but a bargain nonetheless. One more thing, Lillian added as he released her hand. Please call me Lillian. If we're to be partners and spouses, formality seems rather unnecessary. Ethan, he replied. My name is Ethan. Ethan. She tested the name, nodded. All right then, Ethan, show me this ranch of yours. I want to see what we're working with. The road turned, following the curve of Miller's Creek, and the ranch came into view. Ethan saw it through her eyes, the house that needed paint, the sagging barn roof, the fields of wheat that should have been golden but looked thin and patchy, the orchard where dead branches reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers. It looked exactly like what it was, a dying operation held together by stubbornness and prayer. He waited for her to flinch, to show disappointment, to reveal that she'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, Lillian leaned forward slightly, her eyes scanning every detail with that same intense focus she'd shown at the train station. Stop here for a moment, she said. Ethan pulled the horses to a halt at the top of the rise that overlooked the property. Lillian stood up in the wagon, one hand gripping the seat back for balance, studying the land with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. The creek runs year-round? She asked. Yes, even in drought. The wheat fields, they're all planted the same crop? Yes, wheat's what my father always grew. She pointed to the neglected orchard. How many trees? Maybe 40, apples mostly, a few pear trees. When did someone last harvest them? Ethan felt heat creep up his neck. 2 years ago. I've been too busy with the other work. So the fruit just falls and rots? Yes. Another failure to add to his list. But Lillian wasn't looking at him with judgment. She was still studying the land, and now she was nodding slowly, as if pieces were coming together in her mind. The outbuildings that need repair. What were they used for? One was a smokehouse. The other was storage. Could they be made functional again? Maybe, with time and materials. And the cattle? Are they producing? We get milk from 2 cows. The rest are for eventual sale, but prices have been terrible. Lillian finally sat back down, but her eyes were still active, still calculating. All right, take me to the house. I want to see the account books. The account books? Ethan echoed. Now? Don't you want to rest? You've been traveling for the account books, Lillian repeated firmly. We have 30 days, Ethan. I can rest when I understand exactly what we're facing. As they rode down toward the house, Ethan felt something strange stirring in his chest. It wasn't quite hope. Hope felt too fragile, too dangerous, but it was something. This woman, this stranger who would become his wife tomorrow, wasn't running. She wasn't defeated. She was preparing for battle. Maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference. The wagon pulled up in front of the house, and Ethan helped Lillian down. She stood for a moment, looking at the structure. A simple wooden frame building with a porch that had been built by his father's own hands. It wasn't much, but it was solid. Honest work. Honestly made. It's a good house, Lillian said quietly, and somehow, coming from her, it didn't sound like empty politeness. It has strong bones. Thank you. Ethan grabbed her trunk. I'll show you to your room. You'll have the bedroom in the back. I've been sleeping in the other one, but I can move my things to the barn. That won't be necessary, Lillian interrupted. After tomorrow, we'll be married. We might as well begin as we mean to continue. She saw his expression and added dryly, We're both adults, Ethan, and we have more pressing concerns than sleeping arrangements. She paused. Though I would appreciate privacy tonight, of course. To prepare. Of course. Ethan led her inside, acutely aware of how bare and masculine the house looked. His mother's touches had faded over the past year. No curtains on the windows, no flowers on the table, just furniture and function. Lillian walked through the sitting room, trailing her fingers along the back of the worn sofa, taking in the cold fireplace, the empty shelves. She glanced into the kitchen, clean but sparse, with dishes stacked neatly and a pot of day-old stew on the stove. You keep it tidy, she observed. My mother taught me that much. Good. She moved to the bedroom door he'd indicated and looked inside. A simple room with a bed frame, a dresser, and a small window looking out toward the creek. This will do nicely. Ethan set her trunk at the foot of the bed. I'll, give you some time to settle in. When you're ready, the account books are in the desk in the sitting room, along with the bank's letters and... He gestured helplessly. All of it. Lillian turned to face him, and her expression had shifted into something almost gentle. Ethan, I know this is strange. All of it. You expected one thing and you got something entirely different. I'm not what you needed and this isn't what I imagined, but we're here now and we've made our agreement, so let's see it through. She held out her hand one more time. Partners? Ethan took her hand, felt that firm, businesslike grip. Partners. Good. Now, I'd like to change into something more practical, and then I want to see those books. We have work to do. She closed the door gently, leaving Ethan standing in the hallway, feeling like his entire world had tilted on its axis. He'd invited a mail-order bride expecting either salvation or disaster. What he'd gotten was something he hadn't anticipated at all. A partner who looked at his failing ranch and saw possibilities instead of ruins. An hour later, Ethan sat at the kitchen table watching Lillian work her way through his account books, with a growing sense of both dread and fascination. She'd changed into a simpler dress, still finer than anything the local women wore, but practical enough for work. She'd removed her elaborate hairpins, pulling her dark hair back into a simple knot at the base of her neck. With a pencil tucked behind one ear and reading spectacles perched on her nose, another surprise, those spectacles, she looked less like a society lady and more like exactly what she'd claimed to be, a woman trained for business. The account books, his father's ledgers, and every scrap of paper related to the ranch's finances were spread across the table. Lillian had been reading for nearly an hour, making occasional notes on a separate sheet, her expression growing more and more intent. Ethan had tried to offer her tea, dinner, something, but she'd waved him away each time with an absent later. He'd finally given up and just sat, watching her work and trying not to think about the wedding tomorrow, about what came after, about the fact that this strange, focused woman would be his wife in less than 24 hours. Finally, Lillian sat back, removed her spectacles, and rubbed her eyes. When she looked at him, her expression was grave. "It's worse than I thought," she said bluntly. Ethan's stomach dropped. Worse than foreclosure in 30 days? The foreclosure is only the most immediate problem, but it's part of a larger pattern. She tapped the ledgers. "Your father was a good rancher, but a poor businessman. No offense intended." "None taken, I know that." "These books, they're incomplete, disorganized. There's no clear picture of what resources you actually have, what's productive and what's not. You're paying for feed you don't need, maintaining equipment that should have been sold years ago, planting crops that barely break even." She pulled one ledger closer. "This entry from 3 years ago, you sold 20 head of cattle for how much?" $11 a head. And last year? $9 a head. So prices have dropped, but you keep raising the same number of cattle at the same costs. Do you see the problem?" Ethan felt heat rising in his face. I just did what my father did." "I understand. But what worked 10 years ago doesn't work now. The market has changed. The land has changed. Your situation has changed." Her tone wasn't harsh, just matter of fact. "This apple orchard, when did it last produce a profit?" "Never, that I know of. My mother wanted it, so my father planted it. It was more for our use than for selling." "But apple preserves, dried apples, those sell for good prices, don't they?" "I suppose. I've never tried to sell them." Lillian made another note. "Water rights. You have reliable access to Miller's Creek?" "Yes, it runs through my land." "And your neighbors?" "The Hendersons to the west have to haul water in dry season. The Morrison place east of here sold last year because they couldn't sustain crops without reliable water. So water is valuable." More notes. "This land you're not using, the 40 acres in the northeast section, why is it sitting fallow?" "Too far from the house, too much work to farm it alone." "Could it be sold separately?" Ethan frowned. "Maybe. I never thought about it." "Why not?" "Because—" He struggled to put it into words. "It's part of the ranch. My father acquired it. Selling it feels like giving up." Lillian's expression softened slightly. "Ethan, I understand attachment to land, I do, but sometimes letting go of one piece saves the whole. If that 40 acres could bring in $200, and you don't have the resources to use it productively, isn't it better to sell it and save the rest?" The logic was undeniable, but it still felt like failure. "I suppose." She went back to the ledgers, cross-referencing numbers, making more notes. Ethan watched her work, marveling at the speed and confidence with which she moved through information that had always seemed impenetrable to him. "There are opportunities here," Lillian said finally. "Problems, yes. Significant problems. But also opportunities. You have water when others don't. You have land that could be put to better use. You have an orchard that's been ignored. You have—" She pulled out the bank's letter, studied it again. "You have 30 days, which means we need to act fast." "What do you suggest?" Lillian stood, walked to the window, looked out at the darkening prairie. "First, we marry tomorrow as planned. That makes me legally able to act on behalf of the ranch. Second, we go to the bank and ask for a 60-day extension instead of 30. They won't give it. They might, if we present them with a solid plan." She turned back to him. "Third, we sell that northeast 40 acres immediately. Fourth, we harvest and preserve everything we can from that orchard. Fifth, we diversify, reduce the cattle herd to what we can actually maintain, try alternative crops in some of the fields. Sixth, we cut every unnecessary expense and find ways to add income." Ethan felt dizzy listening to her rattle off steps like she was reading from a book. "You think all that can save us?" "I think it gives us a fighting chance." She came back to the table, started gathering the papers. "But I need to be honest with you, Ethan. Even if we do everything right, even if we work ourselves to exhaustion, we might still lose. The numbers are bad. The timing is terrible. We're starting from a position of extreme weakness. Then why try? Lillian met his eyes, and in hers he saw something fierce and unyielding. Because the alternative is giving up, and I didn't travel 1,500 miles to give up. Because you asked for my help, and I don't offer help half-heartedly. And because... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because we both need this to work. You need to save your family's legacy. I need to prove my father's teaching wasn't wasted. Those are powerful motivators. Ethan stood, moved to stand across the table from her. I just want you to know I'm grateful. However this turns out, I'm grateful you're willing to try. Thank you. She smiled slightly. Now, I believe you mentioned something about stew. I haven't eaten since breakfast, and if I'm to be married tomorrow, I should probably have some strength for it. Over a simple dinner of reheated stew and yesterday's bread, they talked through more details. The wedding ceremony tomorrow at the church, the names of neighbors she should know, the layout of the land. Lillian asked questions constantly, storing away information like a squirrel preparing for winter. As the evening deepened and lamps were lit, Ethan found himself relaxing slightly. Yes, she was educated and elegant, and nothing like he'd expected. But she was also direct, practical, and genuinely committed to helping. That was more than he dared hope for. When Lillian finally declared herself exhausted and retreated to her room, Ethan sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the account book she'd organized into neat stacks. Tomorrow, he'd marry a woman he barely knew. Tomorrow, they'd begin a partnership based on mutual desperation and slim hope. Tomorrow, everything would change. He thought about her words. We're starting from a position of extreme weakness. But they were starting. That was more than he'd had a week ago. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the dry grass, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. Ethan blew out the lamp and headed to his own room. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it a wedding, a wife, and the beginning of either salvation or final disaster. He was betting everything on the hope that Lillian Moore, refined, mysterious, and determined, could see what he'd been blind to. That somewhere in the chaos of failing crops and mounting debts, there was a path forward. Tomorrow, they'd start walking that path together. As equals. As partners. As husband and wife. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when Ethan woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen. For a disoriented moment, he thought his mother was there, preparing breakfast as she'd done every morning of his childhood. Then reality crashed back. His mother was gone, and today he was getting married. He dressed quickly in his only good suit, the one he'd worn to his mother's funeral, and emerged to find Lillian already awake and working at the kitchen table. She'd lit the stove and put coffee on, but her attention was fixed on the papers spread before her, that same intense focus he'd seen yesterday. "You're up early," he said. She glanced up, and he was struck again by how different she looked from any woman he'd known. Even in the simple dress she'd worn yesterday, with her hair still in that practical knot, she carried herself with an elegance that seemed out of place in his rough kitchen. "I couldn't sleep much," she admitted. "Too much to think about. Coffee's ready if you want some." Ethan poured 2 cups, set one beside her elbow. She murmured thanks without looking up from her calculations. He stood there awkwardly, drinking his coffee, wondering what one said to a woman on the morning you were to marry her. "Lillian," he started, then stopped. "About today? The ceremony is at 10 o'clock, correct?" "Yes, at the church. Pastor Reynolds will officiate. It'll be quick, just the vows, the signing. I didn't arrange anything fancy because you don't have money for fancy, and neither do I." She finally looked up at him, her expression matter-of-fact. "I appreciate the honesty, Ethan. Truly. Too many men would have tried to pretend otherwise." She set down her pencil. "I've been thinking about what I said last night, about going to the bank." "And?" "I think we should go this afternoon, after the wedding, strike while we have momentum." Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "This afternoon? On our wedding day?" "Why wait?" Lillian stood, moved to the stove to refill her cup. "Every day we delay is a day less we have to execute our plan. Besides, appearing as a married couple strengthens our position, shows commitment, stability." "The banker, Charles Hammond, he's not exactly sympathetic. He's been pushing for this foreclosure." "Then we'll need to be persuasive." She returned to her seat, pulled out a clean sheet of paper. I've drafted the outline of what we'll present. We'll ask for 60 days, show him exactly how we'll use that time, demonstrate that we're serious about turning things around. And if he says no, then we're no worse off than we already are. She met his eyes. But he won't say no. Not if we present this correctly. Her confidence was both inspiring and terrifying. Ethan wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that her education and business sense could accomplish what his hard work hadn't. But a lifetime of disappointment had taught him to guard his hope carefully. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Lillian retreated to her room to dress for the ceremony while Ethan hitched the wagon and tried to calm his racing heart. This was really happening. In a few hours, he'd be married to a woman he'd met yesterday, gambling everything on her promise that she could see solutions where he saw only problems. When Lillian emerged, Ethan's breath caught. She wore a dress of deep blue, not white, which would have been inappropriate for a hasty frontier wedding, but elegant nonetheless. Her hair was arranged in that intricate style again, and she'd added a small hat with a modest veil. She looked like she belonged in a church back east, not the rough-hewn chapel of Sterling Creek. "You look—" Ethan struggled for words. "Very fine." "Thank you." A faint flush touched her cheeks. "I wanted to look respectable, for your sake as much as mine." The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The main street of Sterling Creek was busier than usual. Saturday brought farmers and ranchers in for supplies and socializing. Ethan felt eyes following them as they rode past, felt the weight of curiosity and judgment. The church stood at the end of the street, a simple white building with a cross on top and flowers planted by the Ladies' Society out front. Pastor Reynolds was waiting on the steps, a kind-faced man in his 60s who'd known Ethan since childhood. "Ethan, my boy." He shook Ethan's hand warmly, then turned to Lillian with genuine welcome in his eyes. "And this must be Miss Moore. Welcome to Sterling Creek, young lady. Welcome indeed." "Thank you, Pastor." Lillian's voice was steady, but Ethan saw her hands grip her small bouquet, wildflowers he'd picked this morning, a bit tighter. "Shall we proceed? I know you wanted to keep things simple." Inside, the church was cool and dim, smelling of beeswax and old wood. A few townspeople had gathered, Betty Franklin and her daughter Mary, old Tom Harrison, the Sutton brothers. Word had spread about the wedding, apparently. Ethan recognized the looks on their faces, curiosity mixed with skepticism. How long would this fancy Eastern lady last? How long before she ran back home? The ceremony was indeed brief. Pastor Reynolds spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about partnership and commitment, but kept it mercifully short. When it came time for the vows, Ethan's voice was rough but clear. "I, Ethan Cole, take you, Lillian Moore, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." Lillian's voice was quieter but equally firm. "I, Lillian Moore, take you, Ethan Cole, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." There was no ring, he couldn't afford one, but she didn't seem to expect one. When Pastor Reynolds pronounced them man and wife and told Ethan he could kiss his bride, Ethan leaned in awkwardly and brushed his lips against her cheek. She smelled like lavender and something else, something he couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or determination. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Cole," Pastor Reynolds beamed. "May your union be blessed with happiness and prosperity." Prosperity? Ethan nearly laughed at the irony. They had 30 days, now 29, to find prosperity or lose everything. After signing the marriage certificate and accepting congratulations from the small gathering, Ethan and Lillian stepped out into the bright morning. Mrs. Cole. She was Mrs. Cole now. The thought felt surreal. "Well," Lillian said, adjusting her hat. "That's done. Now for the hard part." "The bank?" "The bank." They walked down the main street together, Lillian's hand resting lightly on his arm in the proper manner of a wife. More people stared. More whispers followed. Ethan held his head high, refused to show the fear churning in his gut. The First Bank of Sterling Creek occupied a brick building on the corner of Main and Oak Streets, the only brick building in town, a symbol of permanence and power. Charles Hammond's office was on the second floor, overlooking the street like a hawk watching for prey. The clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy, looked up as they entered. His eyes widened when he saw Lillian. "Mr. Cole, Can I help you?" "We need to see Mr. Hammond," Ethan said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but Mr. Hammond doesn't see people without appointments." Lillian stepped forward, and something in her bearing made Timothy straighten unconsciously. "Please inform Mr. Hammond that Mr. and Mrs. Cole are here to discuss the ranch loan. We have a proposal that he'll want to hear." The use of Mrs. Cole seemed to register. Timothy blinked. You got married?" "This morning," Lillian said smoothly, which is precisely why this conversation is time-sensitive. "Would you please check if Mr. Hammond has a few moments?" Something in her tone, polite but unyielding, made Timothy nod and scurry up the stairs. Ethan looked at Lillian with new respect. She'd been in town for less than 24 hours, and she already knew how to command attention. Timothy returned looking flustered. "Mr. Hammond will see you, but he only has 15 minutes. 15 minutes will be sufficient." They climbed the narrow stairs to Hammond's office. Charles Hammond sat behind a massive oak desk that dominated the small room, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and the satisfied look of someone who held power over others. He didn't stand when they entered. "Cole." His eyes shifted to Lillian, assessed her with the practiced gaze of someone evaluating collateral. "And this must be the mail-order bride I've been hearing about. Congratulations on your marriage." The way he said it made the word sound cheap. Ethan's hands clenched, but Lillian's grip on his arm tightened slightly. A warning. "Thank you, Mr. Hammond," she said graciously. "I'm Lillian Cole. I'm here because my husband and I have a proposal regarding the ranch loan." Hammond leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Cole, I appreciate the initiative, but the situation is quite simple. The loan is due. Your husband doesn't have the money. In 29 days, the bank will foreclose. I see no room for negotiation. Nevertheless, I'd like to present an alternative." Lillian opened the leather folder she'd brought, pulled out the neat pages she'd prepared. "If you'll give me just a few minutes of your time." Hammond looked annoyed, but gestured for her to continue. "You have 10 minutes. Lillian laid the papers on his desk with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. "Mr. Hammond, I've reviewed the ranch's finances thoroughly. You're correct that the immediate debt cannot be paid in full within 30 days. However, I've identified several opportunities for increased revenue that could put the ranch back on solid financial footing within 60 days. 60 days. Hammond's tone was skeptical. "Mrs. Cole, do you understand how many desperate ranchers have come to me with grand plans and promises? I'm sure many have, but I doubt many have come with a detailed financial analysis." She tapped the papers. "These documents show current assets, potential revenue streams, and a specific timeline for implementation. I'm not asking you to take anything on faith. I'm showing you concrete numbers." Despite himself, Hammond pulled the papers closer and began to read. Ethan watched his face, saw the skepticism gradually shift to something else. Interest, maybe, or at least curiosity. "You're proposing to sell the northeast 40 acres, Hammond said. "Yes, it's underutilized and distant from the main operations. We've already identified a potential buyer. The Henderson Ranch to the west needs land with better water access. We estimate we can sell it for $200 to $250. That's less than a third of what you owe. But it's a start. Combined with the apple harvest, preserved and dried fruit sells for premium prices, and a reduction in operating costs through better resource management, we project we can pay $400 within 45 days and the remainder within 90. Hammond's eyebrows rose. "You've done all this analysis in one day." "I've been trained in financial analysis, Mr. Hammond. This is what I do." Lillian's voice was calm, professional. "I understand the bank's position. You have a responsibility to your depositors. But foreclosing on the ranch means selling it at auction, which typically brings far less than market value. And auctions take time during which the property sits unproductive. Our proposal gives you a better return with less risk. She's right about auction prices, Hammond admitted grudgingly. But 60 days assumes everything goes according to plan. What if it doesn't? Then we're no worse off than we are now, and you foreclose. But if we succeed, you get full repayment plus interest, and you maintain a productive ranch in your portfolio rather than taking a loss on a forced sale. Hammond studied the papers again, his fingers drumming on the desk. Ethan barely dared to breathe. Everything hinged on this moment. These projections, Hammond said finally, they're optimistic. They're realistic, Lillian corrected firmly. I've been conservative in my estimates. If anything, we may exceed them. And if you don't? Then at the end of 60 days, you'll have received partial payment that you wouldn't have had otherwise, and the ranch will be in better condition for sale. Lillian leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hammond, I'm not asking for charity. I'm proposing a business arrangement that benefits both parties. That's all. The silence stretched out. Hammond looked at the papers, then at Lillian, then at Ethan. Finally, he set the documents down and folded his hands. Mrs. Cole, you make a compelling argument, more compelling than I expected from a woman fresh off the stagecoach. He paused. I'll give you 45 days, not 60. 45 days to show me $300 in payment. If you can do that, I'll extend the remainder of the loan another 45 days. But if you miss that first deadline, the foreclosure proceeds immediately. No second chances. Lillian's expression didn't change, but Ethan saw her shoulders relax slightly. That's acceptable. Thank you, Mr. Hammond. Don't thank me yet. 45 days is not much time. He pulled out a form and began writing. I'll need both of you to sign this amendment to the loan terms. They signed. Ethan's hand was shaking slightly as he wrote his name, but Lillian's signature was steady and elegant. When they stepped out of the bank into the afternoon sun, Ethan felt dizzy with relief and terror in equal measure. We did it, he said. We bought time, Lillian corrected. Now comes the truly hard part, actually doing what I promised. Over the next week, Ethan discovered that Lillian's determination was no exaggeration. She worked from dawn until well past dark, and she expected the same from him. Any romantic notions he might have had about being newlyweds evaporated in the face of brutal, exhausting labor. The first priority was the Northeast 40 acres. Lillian drafted a sale proposal and sent Ethan to the Henderson Ranch with it. Daniel Henderson, a weathered rancher in his 50s, looked skeptical at first. You're selling off land? Henderson scratched his jaw. That's a sign of desperation, Cole. It's a sign of smart business, Ethan replied, using Lillian's words. You need reliable water access. I need capital. This land has creek access and borders your property. We both benefit. Henderson studied the proposed terms, $200, half now and half in 30 days. It was a fair price, maybe even generous. After a long pause, he nodded. Your new wife's idea? Yes. She's got a good head on her shoulders then. All right, deal. When Ethan returned with $100 in cash, Lillian's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Excellent. That's the first piece falling into place. The next piece was the orchard. They spent 2 full days harvesting every apple that was remotely salvageable. The trees had been neglected for so long that the fruit was small and misshapen, but Lillian insisted it would work for preserves and drying. In Boston, dried fruit sells for high prices in winter, she explained as they worked side by side, filling basket after basket. People want sweets, and sugar is expensive. Dried apples are an affordable luxury. How do you dry them? Slice thin, lay them in the sun on clean cloth, turn them regularly until they're leathered. I helped our cook do it when I was young. She paused in her work, wiping sweat from her forehead. Before everything fell apart, our house was full of such projects. My mother believed in self-sufficiency. It was the first personal detail she'd volunteered about her past. Ethan wanted to ask more, but she'd already returned to picking apples with focused intensity. They worked together in a rhythm that surprised Ethan. Lillian wasn't afraid of physical labor. Her hands blistered and bled from the rough work, but she never complained. At night, she'd soak her hands in salt water and return to the account books, cross-referencing expenses, identifying more areas to cut costs. We're spending too much on cattle feed, she announced one evening. You're buying grain when you have perfectly good grazing land. The grass is half dead from drought. Then we reduce the herd size. 23 cattle is more than we can sustain efficiently. We keep the best 10 for breeding and milk. Sell the rest. Cattle prices are terrible right now. Better a small amount now than losing them to starvation in winter. She showed him her calculations. Selling 13 head at $9 each gives us $117. That's more than a quarter of what we need for the first payment. Ethan hated the logic of it, but he couldn't argue with the numbers. They spent a grueling day separating the herd, keeping the healthiest animals, and driving the rest to the livestock auction in a neighboring town. The prices were exactly as bad as he'd feared, but Lillian had been right. Having the money was better than the alternative. 2 weeks after the wedding, they met at the kitchen table to review their progress. Lillian had created a detailed chart showing every dollar earned and every dollar owed. Northeast 40 acres, first payment, $100, she read aloud. Cattle sale, $117. Apple preserves sold to the general store, $32. Reduction in feed costs, estimated $15 per month. Current total toward first payment, $249. We need $300, Ethan said. We're still $51 short, and we've only got 30 days left. I know, Lillian tapped her pencil against the table. We need one more significant revenue stream. Like what? We've sold everything we can spare. Not everything. She pulled out a map of the ranch she'd been creating. Look at this area near the creek. Your soil there is rich because of the water. You're planting wheat, which needs a lot of land for modest profit. But what if we planted something more valuable per acre? Like what? Vegetables. Potatoes, carrots, beans. They sell for better prices, and you can grow more value in less space. It's too late in the season for most vegetables. Not for potatoes. We plant them now. We can harvest in late September. And I've been talking to Mrs. Franklin at the general store. She says there's strong demand for fresh vegetables. Most people are growing their own, but by fall, everyone's crops are depleted. Late potatoes sell for premium prices. Ethan wanted to object, to say it was too risky, too much work. But looking at Lillian's determined face, at the careful calculations she'd made, at the way she'd thrown herself into saving his ranch with everything she had, he found himself nodding. All right, we'll try it. They planted 2 acres of potatoes in the creek bottom land, working until their backs screamed and their hands bled. Other ranchers passing by shook their heads at the sight. Potatoes were farmer crops, not rancher crops. But Lillian ignored the judgment, and so did Ethan. At night, they collapsed into bed too exhausted for anything but sleep. Their marriage was entirely practical. They shared a bed because it made sense. They worked together because they had to, but there was no romance in it. Ethan sometimes caught himself wondering what she thought about that, but there was never time to ask. Every moment was consumed by the desperate race against the deadline. 3 weeks after the wedding, with the first payment deadline approaching rapidly, disaster struck. Ethan came in from the fields to find Lillian sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a letter with an expression of barely controlled fury. What is it? The Henderson family. She held up the letter. They're refusing to pay the second $100 for the land. Ethan's blood ran cold. What? Why? They claim the survey was off, that the land doesn't actually include as much creek access as they thought. They're threatening to demand their first payment back. That's ridiculous. The survey was accurate. They're just trying to get out of paying. I know. Lillian's jaw was set. Which means we need to handle this very carefully. If they demand the $100 back and we've already spent it, we're ruined. They drove to the Henderson ranch that afternoon. Daniel Henderson met them on his porch, looking uncomfortable but stubborn. Nothing personal, Cole, he said, but my son measured the property and we're not getting what we paid for. Your son measured wrong, Ethan said flatly. I have the original survey from when my father bought that land. The boundaries are exactly as stated. Maybe your father's survey was wrong. Or maybe you're trying to cheat us. The words came out harsher than Ethan intended, driven by fear and frustration. Henderson's face darkened. You calling me a cheat? Gentlemen, Lillian's voice cut through the rising anger like a knife. Perhaps we can resolve this without accusations. She turned to Henderson. Mr. Henderson, I understand your concern. You want to ensure you're getting fair value. Would you be willing to have an independent surveyor verify the boundaries? The cost would be split between us. Henderson hesitated. Independent surveyor costs money. Less money than a legal dispute would cost either of us, Lillian said reasonably, and it resolves the question definitively. If the boundaries are as we stated, and I assure you they are, you pay the remaining $100. If they're not, we'll renegotiate fairly. It was a calculated risk. They couldn't really afford a surveyor, but they also couldn't afford to lose the sale. Henderson looked between them, then slowly nodded. All right. Fair enough. The surveyor came 2 days later and confirmed what Ethan had known all along. The boundaries were exactly as stated. Henderson grumbled but paid the remaining $100. When they returned home with the money, Ethan found his hands shaking with relief. That was close, he said. Too close. Lillian carefully recorded the payment in her ledger. We can't afford any more surprises like that. But the surprises kept coming. A week before the first payment was due, half the potato crop was destroyed by an early frost. Then one of their best milk cows went lame and had to be put down. Then a wheel on the wagon broke, requiring expensive repairs. Each disaster chipped away at their carefully calculated cushion. With 3 days left before the deadline, they sat at the kitchen table adding and re-adding the numbers, hoping somehow they would change. $283, Lillian said finally. We're still $17 short. Ethan put his head in his hands. We're not going to make it. Don't say that. But even Lillian's voice lacked its usual certainty. We've done everything we could think of. We've sold everything we can spare. We've worked ourselves half to death. And we're still going to fail. Silence fell over the kitchen. Outside, the prairie wind rattled the windows. Somewhere, a coyote howled at the rising moon. Then Lillian stood abruptly and went to her bedroom. Ethan heard her moving things around, and when she returned, she was carrying a small wooden box. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside were pieces of jewelry, a pearl necklace, a silver brooch, a pair of gold earrings. These were my mother's, Lillian said quietly. They're the last things I have from her. They should be worth at least $25. Ethan stared at the jewelry, then at Lillian. Her face was composed, but he could see the cost of this offer in her eyes. I can't ask you to sell your mother's jewelry. You're not asking. I'm offering. She met his gaze steadily. We're partners, Ethan. This ranch is as much mine now as it is yours. If selling these pieces saves it, then that's what we do. Lillian, my mother would understand. She'd approve even. She always said family was more important than things. Lillian closed the box gently. And like it or not, we're family now. The next morning, they took the jewelry to the general store. Mrs. Franklin examined each piece with a jeweler's eye, then offered them $30. It was probably less than they were worth, but they didn't have time to negotiate. With the jewelry money added to their total, they had $313, just barely over the threshold Hammond had demanded. On the morning of the deadline, they walked into the bank together and laid the cash on Hammond's desk. He counted it twice, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he nodded. $313. Acceptable. He wrote out a receipt. You've met the first deadline, Mr. and Mrs. Cole. You now have 45 more days to pay the remaining $534 plus accumulated interest. That's $582 total. $582. It seemed impossible, but they'd made the first deadline when that had seemed impossible too. As they walked out of the bank, Lillian took Ethan's arm, and for the first time it felt less like a formal gesture and more like something real. Like partnership, like trust. We did it, Ethan said. We did part 1, Lillian corrected, but she was smiling. Now we do part 2. That night, sitting across from each other at dinner, Ethan realized something had shifted between them. They weren't strangers anymore, weren't just business partners fulfilling an arrangement. They were something else, something that didn't quite have a name yet, but felt like it might grow into one. Thank you, he said, for the jewelry, for everything. Lillian set down her fork, her expression serious. Ethan, there's something I need to tell you about my past, about why I really left Boston. His heart clenched. All right. She took a breath, and he could see her gathering courage. I told you my father was disgraced. That's true. But there's more to the story. And if we're truly going to be partners, real partners, not just people working toward a common goal, then you deserve to know the whole truth. Ethan's hand stilled on his coffee cup. The lamplight cast shadows across Lillian's face, making her expression hard to read, but he could hear the tension in her voice. Whatever she was about to tell him, it cost her something to say it. I'm listening, he said quietly. Lillian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but laced with old pain. My father, Nathaniel Moore, was brilliant with numbers. He could look at a business and see immediately where it was bleeding money, where opportunities were being missed. He built his reputation on that skill, and for 20 years he was one of the most sought-after consultants in Boston. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the window frame. But he had a weakness. He trusted people too easily. He believed that if someone came to him for help, they were honest, that they wanted to build something legitimate. The client who committed fraud, Ethan said, remembering what she'd told him that first day. Thomas Whitmore, a shipping merchant. He came to my father with a struggling business and asked for help reorganizing his operations. My father threw himself into the work, he always did, and over 6 months, he restructured Whitmore's entire company. New accounting systems, new operational procedures, everything. Her voice hardened. What he didn't know was that Whitmore was using those new systems to hide embezzlement. Whitmore was stealing from his own investors, and my father's clean, organized books made it nearly impossible to detect. Ethan set down his cup. Your father didn't know? He didn't know. But when the fraud was discovered, when investors lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, they didn't care about my father's ignorance. They saw his name on those books, saw his systems being used to commit crimes, and they assumed he was complicit. She turned from the window, her eyes fierce. There was an investigation. Weeks of questions, accusations, newspapers printing my father's name alongside words like accomplice and conspirator. In the end, they found no evidence that he'd known about the fraud. They couldn't prove criminal intent. But in Boston society, being found not guilty isn't the same as being considered innocent. So they destroyed him anyway. They destroyed him, Lillian confirmed bitterly. Every client left, every door closed. Men who'd been his friends for decades crossed the street to avoid speaking to him. We went from being respected members of society to being pariahs in a matter of weeks. She moved back to the table, sat down heavily. My father never recovered. The shame broke something in him. He spent his last 2 years trying to rebuild, trying to prove his innocence. But no one would listen. When he died, I think it was as much from a broken heart as from the pneumonia. Ethan reached across the table, covered her hand with his. I'm sorry. That's a hell of a thing to live through. My mother died 6 months later. The doctors said it was heart failure, but I knew better. She died of grief and exhaustion. Lillian's voice wavered slightly. I was left alone with debts I couldn't pay, in a city that wanted nothing to do with me. The only reason I had a roof over my head was because my mother's cousin took me in, grudgingly. She made it clear every day that I was a burden, that my presence in her home was damaging her own reputation. So you decided to leave. I decided I couldn't live like that anymore, depending on someone's charity, being treated like a shameful secret. And I realized that if I stayed in Boston, I would always be Nathaniel Moore's daughter, always be tainted by scandal. But out here, she gestured to the darkness beyond the window. Out here, I could be someone else. Someone defined by what I do, not by what my father was accused of. Ethan understood that desire in his bones. That's why you came west. That's why I answered your advertisement. You needed help, and I needed a fresh start. I thought it was a fair exchange. She met his eyes. But there's more you should know, Ethan. More about why I left when I did. Something in her tone made his stomach clench. What happened? Lillian took a shaky breath. 3 months before I left Boston, Thomas Whitmore was released from prison. He'd served only 2 years of his sentence, some legal technicality, some connection his lawyers exploited. When he got out, he came to my cousin's house looking for me. Why? Because he blamed my father for his conviction. In his twisted logic, If my father hadn't created such organized books, the fraud would never have been detected. He wanted— She swallowed hard. He wanted me to publicly state that my father had been involved, that he'd known about the scheme. He said if I did that, he'd give me money. $10,000. Ethan's jaw clenched. He tried to bribe you to lie about your own father. He tried to bribe me first. When I refused, he threatened me, said he'd ruin what little reputation I had left, said he'd make sure no one in Boston would even sell me bread. Her hands were shaking now. I told him to leave. He grabbed my arm, started shouting. My cousin's butler heard the commotion and threw him out, but Whitmore stood in the street screaming that I was just like my father, a fraud and a liar. Neighbors heard. Within a day, the story was everywhere. Whitmore claimed I'd been working with my father all along, that I was trying to blackmail him. That's insane. It's also believable to people who already thought the worst of us. Lillian's voice was hollow. My cousin gave me a week to leave her house, said she couldn't afford the scandal. So I took what little I had, answered your advertisement, and got on a train heading as far from Boston as I could manage. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Ethan tried to process everything she'd told him, tried to understand the weight she'd been carrying. This wasn't just about business skills or a fresh start. This was about survival, about escaping a past that had tried to crush her. Why are you telling me this now? He asked finally. Because tomorrow, we go back to the bank. Because we're fighting to save this ranch together. And because— She looked down at her hands. Because I've been lying to you by omission. You deserve to know who you married, what you married. I'm not just a woman with business skills. I'm a woman with a scandal attached to her name. If anyone from Boston ever comes here, if anyone ever recognizes me, that scandal could touch you too. Could hurt your reputation, could make it harder to do business. She raised her eyes to his. You deserve to know the risk you're taking by keeping me here. Ethan stood, walked around the table, and crouched beside her chair so they were eye to eye. Lillian, look at me. She met his gaze, and he saw fear there. Real fear that he would send her away, that he would decide she wasn't worth the risk. I don't care about Boston's scandal, he said firmly. I don't care what some criminal said about you or what society people thought. I care about what I've seen in the last month. I've seen you work harder than anyone I've ever known. I've seen you sacrifice your mother's jewelry to save a ranch that wasn't even yours. I've seen you stand up to a banker twice your size and make him back down through sheer force of will. That's who you are. Not what happened to your father, not what some bastard said in the street. You. Lillian's eyes glistened. You don't understand what scandal can do. How it spreads. How it poisons everything it touches. Maybe I don't, but I know this. You came here for a fresh start, and I'm not going to take that away from you because of something that wasn't your fault. You're my wife, my partner, and if anyone has a problem with that, they can answer to me. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly. I don't deserve your faith. You've earned it. He took her hands in his. Every day since you arrived, you've earned it. She gripped his hands tightly, and for a long moment, they just sat there in the lamplight, connected by something deeper than their hastily spoken vows or their desperate partnership, something that felt like the beginning of real trust. Finally, Lillian pulled back and stood, composing herself. Thank you for listening, for understanding. She managed a small smile. Now we should probably get some sleep. We have another deadline racing toward us. That night, lying beside her in the darkness, Ethan listened to her breathing gradually slow into sleep. He thought about everything she'd told him, about the courage it must have taken to leave everything familiar and travel 1,500 miles into the unknown. He'd thought he was desperate when he'd placed that advertisement, but Lillian had been desperate in ways he'd never imagined. The next morning brought no rest. They had 45 days to earn nearly $600, and autumn was coming fast. The potato crop they'd planted was nearly ready for harvest, but they needed more revenue streams. Lillian spent hours at the kitchen table, running calculations, cross-referencing market prices, looking for any advantage they'd missed. The apple preserves are selling well at the general store, she said over breakfast. Mrs. Franklin wants more, but we're running out of apples. The trees are picked clean. But the Sutton brothers have an orchard. I saw it when we drove past their place. They don't seem to be harvesting it, probably don't have time with their cattle operation. Ethan nodded slowly. So you're thinking we could offer to harvest their apples in exchange for a share of the fruit? Exactly. We provide the labor, they provide the apples. We split the proceeds 50-50. They get income from an asset they're not using, we get more product to preserve. It made perfect sense. That afternoon, they drove to the Sutton Ranch and made their proposal. The brothers, Jake and Samuel, both weathered men in their 40s, listened skeptically. Preserving apples is women's work, Jake said bluntly. No offense, Mrs. Cole, but that's a lot of labor for not much profit. In winter, Mrs. Franklin sells apple preserves for 75 cents a jar. Lillian replied calmly. A bushel of apples makes approximately 20 jars of preserves. That's $15 per bushel, minus the cost of sugar and jars. Even split 50-50, you're making $6 or $7 per bushel from apples that are currently rotting on the ground. How is that not worthwhile? The brothers exchanged glances. Samuel scratched his beard. When you put it like that, I'll do all the preserving work, Lillian continued. All you have to do is let us harvest. We'll start tomorrow if you agree. They agreed. Over the next 2 weeks, Lillian worked from dawn until long after dark, harvesting apples, boiling them into preserves, sealing jars with practiced efficiency. The kitchen became a production line, with steam perpetually fogging the windows and the sweet smell of cooking apples filling the house. Ethan helped when he could, but the daily ranch work still demanded his attention: cattle to tend, fences to repair, the wheat harvest to complete. The potato harvest came in better than expected despite the frost damage. They'd lost half the crop, but the surviving potatoes were large and healthy. Mrs. Franklin took all of them at premium prices, and the local restaurant in Sterling Creek ordered 3 bushels for their kitchen. That's $85 from the potatoes, Lillian announced, recording the sale in her ledger. Combined with the apple preserves and the reduction in expenses, we're at $230 toward the next payment. We need $350 more, Ethan said. They were sitting at the kitchen table late at night, both exhausted from another 16-hour workday. In 28 days. I know, Lillian rubbed her eyes. I've been thinking about the wheat harvest. You got a poor price for it last year because you sold at the wrong time, right when everyone else was selling and the market was flooded. What if we held some back and sold in winter when prices are higher? That requires storage. The barn isn't weather-tight enough. So we fixed the barn. How much would the materials cost? Ethan did the math in his head. Maybe $40. But that's $40 we need for the payment. It's an investment. If winter wheat prices are 30% higher, and they typically are, we'd make that back several times over. It was sound logic, but it required gambling money they didn't have. Ethan wanted to say no, wanted to play it safe, but they'd been gambling from the start, and so far, Lillian's instincts had been right more often than wrong. All right, he said finally. We fixed the barn. They spent 3 days repairing the barn roof, replacing rotten boards, and sealing gaps that let in weather. It was hard, dangerous work. Ethan nearly fell from the roof twice, and Lillian split her thumb open with a hammer, but they got it done. The wheat they held back filled a quarter of the barn, golden grain that represented both hope and risk. With 3 weeks left before the deadline, another crisis hit. Ethan was in town buying supplies when he ran into Daniel Henderson outside the feed store. Henderson's expression was troubled. "Cole, I need to tell you something," Henderson said quietly. "There's been talk." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What kind of talk?" "About your wife. Some fellow came through Sterling Creek last week asking questions about her. Said he was looking for a woman named Lillian Moore who'd left Boston. Said there was money owed, legal troubles." Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "I told him I didn't know anything about it, but he talked to a lot of folks. Word's spreading." Ethan felt cold despite the afternoon heat. What did this man look like? Tall, thin, well-dressed, city type, had a mean look about him. It could have been anyone. Or it could have been Whitmore tracking Lillian down out of spite or obsession. Either way, it was exactly what Lillian had feared, her past catching up to her. "If you see him again, you let me know," Ethan said firmly, And tell anyone else spreading talk that my wife's business is her own. Henderson nodded. I will. Just thought you should know what's being said. Ethan drove home in a cold fury, his mind racing. Should he tell Lillian? Would it terrify her or just confirm her fears? But they'd promised honesty, and hiding this would violate that promise. When he arrived home, Lillian was in the kitchen as usual, working on another batch of preserves. She took one look at his face and set down her spoon. What's wrong? He told her everything Henderson had said. As he spoke, he watched the color drain from Lillian's face, watched her hands grip the edge of the table for support. He found me, she whispered. Whitmore found me. We don't know it was him. Could have been a debt collector. Could have been... It was him. Her voice was hollow with certainty. He said he'd ruin me. This is how he does it, spreading poison, making people doubt me, destroying my reputation before I can build anything here. Ethan moved to her side. Then we don't give him the chance. We go into town tomorrow, we face whatever talk is happening directly. We don't let him control the narrative. Face it how? What can we possibly say? The truth. That your father was investigated and cleared, that you're here building a new life, that anyone who has a problem with that can come talk to us directly instead of spreading gossip. Lillian looked at him with something like wonder. You'd really stand beside me like that? Publicly? I'm your husband. Where else would I stand? The next morning, they drove into Sterling Creek together. Ethan could feel eyes on them as they walked down the main street, could hear conversations stopping as they passed. The weight of judgment pressed down like a physical thing. They went first to the church, where Pastor Reynolds was tending his small garden. The old pastor looked up as they approached, his expression kind but cautious. Ethan, Mrs. Cole, what brings you by? There's been talk, Ethan said without preamble, about my wife's past. I wanted you to hear the truth from us before the gossip twists it into something it's not. Pastor Reynolds set down his trowel and gestured to a bench. I'm listening. Lillian took a breath and told the story. Her father's work, the fraud, the investigation that cleared him but destroyed his reputation anyway, Whitmore's threats, and her decision to leave. She spoke clearly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. When she finished, Pastor Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, And this man who came through town asking questions, was he part of the original fraud investigation? No, Lillian said. He was the man who committed the fraud, the one who tried to bribe me to lie. I see. The pastor's expression hardened. So a convicted criminal comes to our town spreading rumors about a woman whose only crime was being related to someone he harmed, and people are inclined to believe him? He shook his head. That says more about our town than it does about you, Mrs. Cole. Relief washed over Lillian's face. You believe me. I've watched you work these past weeks. I've seen you in church every Sunday, sitting beside your husband with dirt under your fingernails from honest labor. I've heard from Mrs. Franklin how hard you work, how fair you are in your dealings. That tells me who you are far more than any gossip from a stranger. He stood. I'll address this on Sunday, not by naming you specifically, but by reminding my congregation about bearing false witness and the importance of judging people by their character rather than rumor. They visited Mrs. Franklin next, then Tom Harrison, then several other influential townspeople. Each time Lillian told her story. Some believed immediately. Others were skeptical but willing to withhold judgment. A few, like Marcus Doyle, who owned the saloon, made it clear they thought there was no smoke without fire. Your wife brought her troubles here, Doyle said bluntly. That affects all of us. My wife brought business skills that are saving a ranch and creating opportunities for other ranchers, Ethan shot back. The Sutton brothers are making money they wouldn't have made without her. Henderson bought land he needed because of her negotiating. Mrs. Franklin is selling more preserves than she has in years. How exactly is that bringing trouble? Doyle had no answer to that, but his expression remained hostile. They left his saloon knowing they hadn't won him over, but at least the truth was out there competing with the lies. That Sunday, Pastor Reynolds gave a sermon about the dangers of gossip and the importance of Christian charity. He didn't mention Lillian by name, but everyone knew what he was addressing. Some faces in the congregation looked ashamed. Others remained stony. After the service, Betty Franklin approached them on the church steps. "Mrs.
Cole, I want you to know that I don't put any stock in that terrible talk. You've been nothing but honest and hardworking in all your dealings with me. You're welcome in my store any time." Others followed her lead, the Sutton brothers, old Tom Harrison, several of the ranch wives who'd seen Lillian at town gatherings. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make it clear that Sterling Creek wasn't going to reject her based on one man's poison. As they drove home that afternoon, Lillian was quiet. Finally, she said, "I've never had anyone stand up for me like that before. In Boston, when the scandal hit, everyone just disappeared. Even people I thought were friends." "You have friends here," Ethan said simply. "And you have me." She reached over and took his hand, squeezed it tightly. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, their clasped hands resting on the wagon seat between them. But the relief of weathering the scandal was short-lived. With 2 weeks remaining before the deadline, they were still $300 short. Every revenue stream had been exploited. Every cost had been cut. They were out of options. "We could try to sell more land," Lillian suggested without conviction. She knew as well as Ethan did that they'd already sold the only parcel that had immediate value. "Or we could go back to Hammond and ask for another extension." "He won't give it. We barely got the first one." They sat in frustrated silence, staring at the numbers that wouldn't add up no matter how many times they recalculated them. $300 might as well have been $3,000. Then Ethan remembered something. "The wheat we're holding for winter prices. What if we sold it now? We wouldn't get the premium, but we'd get something." Lillian shook her head. "We'd get maybe $120. Still not enough, and we'd lose the potential for higher winter prices. But if we sold it and took that $120 to the bank now, showed them we're still making progress, maybe that would buy us more time to earn the rest. Or maybe Hammond would just take the $120 and foreclose anyway in 2 weeks." It was a grim possibility, but Ethan couldn't see any alternative. They were trapped, watching the deadline approach like a train they couldn't stop. That night, lying in bed, Lillian suddenly sat up. "What about credit? What about it? Mrs. Franklin has been selling our preserves as fast as we can make them. What if we asked her for credit against future deliveries? We could promise her 20 jars a week for the next 3 months. At 75 cents a jar, that's $60 value. If she'd give us $40 now against that promise, we'd be closer." It was creative, but risky. That requires her to trust us, and it means we'd be obligated to keep producing preserves even after we save the ranch.
"So we keep producing. It's income. Why would we stop?" Lillian's eyes were bright with the idea. "And if we can get credit from Mrs. Franklin, maybe we can get it from others too. Tom Harrison for feed, the lumberyard for future repairs. Not much from each. We're not asking for charity, but credit against promised future business. If we can cobble together $200 that way and sell some of the wheat now for the rest." It was a house of cards, dependent on multiple people trusting them, on their ability to fulfill multiple promises simultaneously, on nothing else going wrong. But it was something. It was hope. Over the next week, they approached every business owner in Sterling Creek with their proposal. Mrs. Franklin agreed to $40 credit. Tom Harrison gave them $30 against future feed purchases. The lumberyard owner, after much persuasion from Pastor Reynolds, agreed to $25. Smaller amounts came from other merchants, $10 here, $15 there. By the time they'd exhausted every possibility, they'd accumulated $165 in credit and promises. Combined with selling the held wheat early, they'd have just enough to make the payment with a few dollars to spare. The night before the deadline, they sat once more at the kitchen table, looking at the final numbers. $587, Lillian read from her ledger. $5 more than we need. "If everyone honors their credit agreements," Ethan added, "they will. They're good people. If the wheat buyer doesn't try to lowball us because we're desperate, he won't. The quality is good. If nothing goes wrong in the next 24 hours. Lillian closed the ledger and looked at him with tired but determined eyes. "Ethan, we've done everything humanly possible. We've worked ourselves to exhaustion, sold everything we could spare, made promises we'll have to keep for months. At some point, we have to trust that it's enough." He knew she was right, but the fear was still there, clawing at his chest.
They'd come so far, sacrificed so much. To lose it all now, to fall short by a handful of dollars after everything. What if it's not enough? He asked quietly. What if we get to the bank tomorrow and discover we miscalculated somewhere, that we're still short? Lillian reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. Then we'll have tried. Honestly and truly tried. And we'll figure out what comes next together. She paused. But I don't think we'll be short. I think we're going to walk into that bank tomorrow and hand Charles Hammond exactly what he demanded. And then we're going to walk out with our heads high and get back to work. Because we'll still have another payment to make in 45 more days. Her confidence steadied him. He squeezed her hands. Together. Together. That night, for the first time since their wedding night, they held each other in bed. Not out of obligation or exhaustion, but out of need for connection, for comfort, for the simple reassurance that they weren't facing this alone. Ethan felt Lillian's heartbeat against his chest, felt her breathing gradually slow as sleep claimed her. He stayed awake longer, watching moonlight paint patterns across the ceiling, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. A desperate advertisement, a woman fleeing scandal, a hastily spoken vow, a partnership forged in crisis. And somehow, against all odds, the beginning of something real. Tomorrow would tell them if any of it mattered. Tomorrow, the bank would either grant them reprieve or take everything. Tomorrow would be triumph or disaster. But tonight, they had each other. Tonight, that was enough. Morning came too quickly. Ethan woke to find Lillian already up, dressed in her best dress, the green one she'd worn that first day, standing at the window watching the sun rise over the prairie. She turned when she heard him stir, and he saw both determination and fear in her eyes. "It's time," she said simply. They ate breakfast in silence, neither able to stomach much. The account books, the carefully counted money, the credit agreements, everything was organized in Lillian's leather folder, ready to present. They'd checked the numbers 3 times last night and once more this morning. $587, $5 more than Hammond had demanded. The ride into town felt longer than usual, every rut in the road jarring, every minute stretching. Other wagons passed them heading toward Sterling Creek for market day, their drivers calling out greetings that Ethan barely heard over the roaring in his ears. Beside him, Lillian sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, but he could see the white knuckles, the tension in her jaw. "Whatever happens," he said as they approached the town, "I want you to know—" "Don't," Lillian interrupted quietly. "Don't say goodbye things. Not yet." He nodded, swallowed the words, and focused on driving. The bank loomed ahead, its brick facade solid and immovable as a mountain. Hammond's domain, the place where their fate would be decided. They climbed down from the wagon and Ethan tied the horses. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the folder, but Lillian's hand on his arm steadied him. "We've done the work," she said. "The numbers are sound. We have nothing to be ashamed of." Timothy the clerk looked up as they entered, his expression sympathetic. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole, Mr. Hammond is expecting you." Of course he was. Hammond had probably been counting down the days, anticipating either their payment or their failure. Ethan couldn't tell which outcome the banker preferred. They climbed the stairs to Hammond's office. The door was open, and Hammond sat behind his massive desk, reading through some papers. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole, right on time." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Please sit." They sat. Ethan placed the folder on the desk between them. Hammond made no move to take it, just leaned back in his chair and studied them with those calculating eyes. "I'll admit," Hammond said finally, "I didn't expect to see you here today. When we made this agreement 6 weeks ago, I gave you perhaps a 10% chance of making the first payment. You proved me wrong. That was surprising." "We keep our word," Lillian said evenly. "So it seems. Which brings us to today. $582 due in full." He leaned forward. "Do you have it?" "We do." Lillian opened the folder, began laying out the documentation with practiced precision. $320 in cash from various sales. Wheat, potatoes, preserved goods. $165 in verified credit agreements with local merchants, all documented and signed. And this? She placed a bank draft on the desk. $102 from the sale of our remaining held wheat, completed this morning before we came here. Hammond picked up each document, examined it carefully. The credit agreements from Mrs. Franklin, from Tom Harrison, from the lumberyard and smaller merchants, the bank draft from the grain buyer, the detailed accounting of every sale, every transaction. Ethan watched his face, trying to read whether they'd made it or whether some technicality would damn them. Finally, Hammond set down the last paper and pulled out his ledger. He made several notations, cross-referenced numbers, checked and rechecked. The silence in the office was suffocating. Outside, Ethan could hear normal town sounds, wagons rattling past, people calling to each other, dogs barking, but in here, time seemed suspended. $587, Hammond said at last. That's your total. Yes, Lillian confirmed, which is $5 more than required. Yes. Hammond made one final notation in his ledger, then looked up at them with an expression that might have been respect. Well, I'll be damned. You actually did it. The relief that flooded through Ethan was so intense it was almost painful. Beside him, Lillian let out a breath she'd been holding, her shoulders dropping slightly. The credit agreements are irregular, Hammond continued, but they're properly documented and the signatories are sound. I'll accept them as payment. He began writing out a receipt. Your loan balance is now $863, including accumulated interest. You have another 45 days to make the next payment of $300 minimum. Same terms as before. If you make it, we extend again. If you don't, foreclosure proceeds immediately. We understand, Lillian said. Hammond handed her the receipt. Mrs. Cole, I've been a banker for 30 years. I've seen more desperate schemes and failed promises than I can count. But what you two have accomplished, he shook his head slightly. It's remarkable, truly. I'd be curious to see how long you can sustain it. We'll sustain it, Ethan said firmly, whatever it takes. I believe you might actually mean that. Hammond stood, extending his hand first to Lillian, then to Ethan. Good luck to you both. You'll need it. They walked out of the bank into the bright September morning, and Ethan felt like he could breathe fully for the first time in weeks. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. 2 payments down, and the ranch was still theirs. We need to celebrate, he said, surprising himself. Lillian looked at him with equally surprised eyes. Celebrate? We just saved the ranch, again. That deserves something more than going straight back to work. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile he'd seen in days. What did you have in mind? Lunch, at the restaurant, a real meal that neither of us has to cook. That's extravagant. We just saved our home. I think we can spare $2 for a decent meal. They ate at Sterling Creek's only restaurant, a modest establishment that served simple fare but served it well. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a meal he hadn't prepared himself, and watching Lillian savor her chicken and dumplings, he realized she probably felt the same way. They talked about everything except the ranch, about books she'd read, about places he'd traveled as a boy, about nothing important and everything that mattered. For an hour, they weren't desperate ranchers fighting foreclosure. They were just a young couple sharing a meal, getting to know each other in ways their circumstances hadn't allowed before. But reality returned as they drove home. $300 in 45 days. It was less than before, but they'd also exhausted most of their quick revenue options. They'd need new strategies, new approaches. The winter wheat prices, Lillian said as they rode. That's our best opportunity. If prices rise the way they typically do, selling our stored grain could give us most of what we need. If prices rise. If they don't, then we'll find another way. We always do. She glanced at him. You know what the difference is between us and other failing ranches? What? We're not just working harder, we're working smarter. We're adapting. Your father ran this ranch the same way for 20 years, and that worked when conditions were stable. But conditions changed, and the ranch couldn't change with it. We're changing it. Every week we're finding new approaches, new revenue, new efficiencies. That's why we'll succeed. Her confidence was infectious. When did you become so certain? When we walked out of that bank the first time and didn't give up. When we made that first payment, everyone said was impossible. When this town tried to run me out with gossip and you stood beside me instead." She met his eyes. "We're a good team, Ethan Cole. Better than either of us expected, I think." "Yeah," he agreed softly. "We are." The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. With the immediate crisis past, they could focus on building rather than just surviving. Lillian's business mind found inefficiencies Ethan had never noticed. Feed being wasted, equipment sitting idle that could be rented to neighbors, small opportunities that added up to real money. They rented their wagon to other ranchers on days they didn't need it, $5 a day. They started selling fresh milk and eggs in town. Small income, but steady. Lillian even negotiated a deal with the restaurant to supply them with preserved vegetables through winter. "It's about diversification," she explained one evening as they went over the books. "Your father relied too heavily on cattle and wheat. If either market was bad, the whole ranch suffered. But if we have 10 small income streams instead of 2 large ones, a failure in one area doesn't sink us." The ranch began to transform under their combined efforts. Fences that had been falling down got repaired. The barn that had been barely functional became weathertight and organized. The orchard, once neglected, was properly pruned and prepared for next year's harvest. Even the house showed signs of care. It hadn't seen since Ethan's mother died. Curtains in the windows, flowers on the table, small touches that made it feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep. But the most significant change wasn't in the property. It was in them. The partnership that had started as pure necessity was evolving into something neither of them had quite anticipated. They worked together with an ease that came from genuine understanding, each anticipating what the other needed. When Ethan struggled with bookkeeping, Lillian taught him patiently. When Lillian's hands were too blistered from farm work to hold a pencil, Ethan took over her writing tasks without being asked. They learned each other's rhythms. Ethan discovered that Lillian was sharpest in the early morning, that she thought best while kneading bread, that she got a particular expression when she was working through a problem and needed silence. Lillian learned that Ethan pushed himself too hard without someone making him rest, that he had a dry wit that emerged when he was comfortable, that he carried guilt about his parents' deaths that colored everything he did. And slowly, carefully, the marriage that had been only practical began to feel real. It started with small things. Ethan bringing her coffee in the morning without being asked. Lillian mending his shirts without making a point of it. Their hands finding each other across the table during evening planning sessions. The way they'd started saying we instead of I without consciously choosing to. Then bigger things. The night Lillian woke from a nightmare about Whitmore and Ethan held her until she stopped shaking, murmuring reassurances into her hair. The afternoon Ethan nearly broke down over a letter from one of his father's old friends, and Lillian sat beside him in silence until he could speak, her presence steady and grounding. 6 weeks after their second payment to the bank, they were preparing for bed when Lillian said suddenly, "I'm happy here." Ethan looked up from removing his boots. "What?" "I'm happy. Here. With you. With this life." She stood in the doorway of their bedroom, backlit by lamplight, her expression almost surprised. "I didn't expect that. I came here for a fresh start, for a purpose, for a way to prove myself. But somewhere along the way, I actually became happy." Ethan stood, moved toward her. "I'm glad, because I'm happy too. I didn't think I could be after losing my parents, after nearly losing the ranch. But you changed that." "We changed it," she corrected, "together." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that had become familiar over the weeks. "Lillian, I know this started as an arrangement, a business partnership between two desperate people, but it's become more than that. At least for me." "For me too," she whispered. "I don't want you to feel obligated. If you want to keep things as they are, just partners working toward a common goal, I understand. But if you want," he struggled to find the words, "if you want something more, something real, I want that too." She stepped closer, placed her hand over his heart. "Ethan Cole, I fell in love with you somewhere between harvesting potatoes and negotiating with Hammond. I'm not entirely sure when it happened. Maybe it was when you defended me to the whole town. Maybe it was when you trusted my business sense even though you had every reason not to. Maybe it was just watching you work yourself to exhaustion every day for something you believed in.
She looked up at him with eyes that held no doubt. But I know I love you, and I know this marriage stopped being an arrangement weeks ago. Relief and joy flooded through him. I love you too.
I think I started falling when you stepped off that stagecoach looking like you belonged somewhere else entirely, but decided to stay anyway. He kissed her then, properly. Not the brief brush of lips from their wedding, but something real and deep and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. So, Lillian said with a smile that transformed her face, I suppose we should consummate this marriage properly. I suppose we should, Ethan agreed, and drew her into their bedroom, closing the door on everything outside, the ranch, the debt, the pressure, the fear, and focusing only on each other. The next morning they woke tangled together, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no immediate urgency to get up and work. They lay in the early light, talking quietly, learning each other in new ways. Tell me about your mother, Lillian said, her head resting on his chest. You never talk about her. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then began. She was strong, stronger than anyone I've ever known. When my father left to fight, she held this ranch together alone, dealt with raiders, with drought, with everything. When he died, she didn't break. She kept going. Raised me, kept the ranch running, never complained. His voice roughened. But I think it cost her. I think she used up all her strength keeping things together. And when I came back from town one winter and took over the heavy work, she finally let herself rest. And once she did, she just faded, like she'd been holding on by will alone. She'd be proud of you, Lillian said softly, fighting this hard to keep what she preserved. Maybe. Or maybe she'd tell me I'm a fool for being so stubborn about land. He ran his fingers through her hair. What about your mother? She was gentle. Too gentle for the life she ended up with. She loved my father completely, believed in him absolutely. When the scandal hit, she tried so hard to maintain appearances, to pretend everything would be fine. But you could see it breaking her day by day. When my father died, she lasted 6 more months out of duty to me, I think, but her heart wasn't in it. Lillian's voice was wistful. I wish she could have met you. She would have liked you. And your father? Would have appreciated your work ethic, but would have driven you crazy trying to optimize every decision. She smiled slightly. He'd have loved this challenge, though, the puzzle of saving the ranch. He lived for problems like this. They talked until the sun was fully up and work could no longer be delayed. But something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer two people working side by side. They were truly partners, in every sense of the word. The third payment deadline approached with less terror than the previous two, though no less urgency. They'd sold their stored wheat at premium winter prices, earning $420, more than enough for the required $300. They made the payment with $12 to spare, and Hammond's expression when they walked into his office was almost amused. You're making a habit of this, he observed. We intend to, Lillian replied. The remaining loan balance was now $547. Hammond set the next deadline at 60 days this time, requiring a payment of $250. You've earned some trust, he admitted grudgingly. Don't make me regret it. They wouldn't. Through October and November, they continued refining their operations. Ethan learned to keep proper books under Lillian's patient teaching. Lillian learned to handle livestock and mend fences under his. They taught each other, supported each other, pushed each other to be better. The town's perception of them shifted too. What had started as skepticism, that fancy Eastern woman won't last a month, gradually became respect. People saw how hard Lillian worked, saw how the coal ranch was transforming from a failing operation into a model of efficiency. Other ranchers started asking Ethan for advice, which really meant asking Lillian's advice through him. She helped Daniel Henderson reorganize his cattle operation for better efficiency. She showed the Sutton brothers how to maximize their orchard income. She even advised Mrs. Franklin on inventory management for the general store. In each case, she asked nothing in return except goodwill, building a network of relationships that strengthened their position in the community. You're making allies, Ethan observed one evening after the Suttons had left following a consultation. I'm building a life, Lillian corrected. This isn't temporary anymore. This is home. These are our neighbors. Helping them helps us. Hey, by December, the ranch was not just surviving but genuinely improving. They had steady income from multiple sources, their costs were under control, and they had a clear path to paying off the remaining debt by spring. The land itself seemed to respond to their care. Fences stood straight, buildings were sound, equipment was maintained properly. But more than the physical improvements, there was something intangible that had changed. The ranch felt alive again in a way it hadn't since Ethan's mother died. There was laughter in the house, conversation over dinner, plans being made not just for survival, but for growth. One cold December afternoon, as they worked together repairing the chicken coop, Ethan paused to watch Lillian hammering a board into place with focused determination. Her dress was covered in sawdust, her hair escaping its pins, her hands rough from work. She looked nothing like the elegant woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 4 months ago. She looked better. She looked like she belonged. "What?" she asked, noticing his stare. "Just thinking about that first day. When you arrived and I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life." "Oh?" She raised an eyebrow, amused. "And now?" "Now I think I made the best decision I've ever made, even if I didn't know what I was deciding at the time." She set down her hammer and moved to kiss him, sawdust and all. "I was terrified that day. You looked so disappointed when you saw me." "I wasn't disappointed. I was intimidated. You looked like you'd stepped out of a painting, and I was offering you a failing ranch and a desperate gamble. You were offering me a chance to prove myself, to build something real, to be valued for what I could do rather than judged for what happened to my father." She took his hands. "That was worth more than any comfort or security. Have I mentioned today that I love you? Not for at least 3 hours. You're getting careless." He pulled her close, despite the cold and the work waiting and everything else. "I love you, Lillian Cole. Every stubborn, brilliant, determined inch of you." "I love you too," she murmured against his chest, "even when you're being impossibly stoic about things that should make you cry. I'm working on that. I know, we're both working on a lot of things." They stood there for a moment, two people who'd started as strangers, become partners, and found love in the process. The wind howled across the prairie, but inside the circle of their embrace, everything was warm. Eventually, they returned to work. There was always more work, but now it felt different. Not like a desperate race against disaster, but like building something that would last, something that was genuinely theirs. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the books, Lillian looked up with satisfaction. "The 4th payment is covered. We'll have it by the deadline with money left over. And after that? One more payment, maybe 2 depending on how Hammond structures it. But Ethan," she smiled, "we're going to make it. The ranch is going to survive." He reached across and took her hand, marveled at how natural that gesture had become. "We're going to make it," he corrected. "The ranch is going to thrive." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." Outside, snow began to fall, the first real snow of winter. It covered the brown prairie grass, softened the hard edges of buildings, made everything clean and new. Tomorrow they'd face whatever challenges came, more work, more payments, more obstacles to overcome. But tonight, they had this moment of peace, this certainty that whatever came, they'd face it together. And that, Ethan realized, was worth more than any amount of money or land. The partnership they'd forged in desperation had become something precious, something that would outlast any crisis. Lillian caught him staring again and laughed. "What is it this time?" "Just thinking that I'm the luckiest man in Nebraska." "Just Nebraska? That's setting the bar pretty low." "Fine. The luckiest man west of the Mississippi." "Better," she allowed, her eyes sparkling. "Though I might argue that I'm the lucky one." "We're both lucky," Ethan decided. "Lucky we found each other. Lucky we were desperate enough to take a chance. Lucky we were smart enough to make it work." "Lucky," Lillian agreed, standing and moving around the table to settle in his lap. "And in love. That's a pretty good combination." "The best combination," he murmured, and kissed her as the snow fell outside and the fire crackled in the hearth in the ranch, their ranch, settled into peaceful winter rest. They'd come so far from that desperate day when she'd arrived, and he'd thought it was all over. They'd built something neither of them could have built alone. And tomorrow, they'd keep building, together, always together. Winter settled over the prairie with a fierce beauty that Ethan had always appreciated, but Lillian was experiencing for the first time. She stood at the kitchen window one January morning, watching snow swirl across the fields in patterns that shifted and changed with every gust of wind, and he saw wonder in her face. "It's so different from Boston winters," she said. "There, everything becomes gray and cramped. Here, it's just vast. All this white space stretching to the horizon." "Wait until spring," Ethan said, coming to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist. "When the grass comes back green and the wildflowers bloom, that's when this land really shows what it can be." "I can't wait to see it." She leaned back against him. "Our first spring together. Our first full year." The fourth payment had been made in mid-December, reducing their debt to $297. Hammond had given them until March 1st for the final payment, 90 days to earn less than $300. After everything they'd been through, it felt almost easy. Almost. But January brought its own challenges. A blizzard hit in the second week, lasting 3 days and burying everything under 2 feet of snow. They spent those days in the house, keeping the fire burning, rationing their food supplies, and hoping the cattle could weather it in the barn. When the storm finally broke and they could dig their way out, they found 2 cattle dead from the cold despite their best efforts. It was a loss, but not a catastrophic one. A year ago, Ethan would have seen it as another disaster. Now, with Lillian's careful planning, they had reserves to absorb such setbacks. "We'll manage," Lillian said, studying the carcasses with practical assessment rather than despair. "The meat can be preserved. The hides can be sold. It's not ideal, but it's not devastating either." That attitude, the ability to see setbacks as obstacles rather than disasters, had become their shared philosophy. When a piece of equipment broke, they fixed it or worked around it. When prices fluctuated, they adjusted their plans. When unexpected expenses arose, they found unexpected income to match. They'd become adaptable in ways that went far beyond what either of them had been alone. February brought the annual Cattlemen's Association meeting in Sterling Creek, a gathering Ethan had always attended but never enjoyed. This year, Lillian insisted on going with him. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. "It's mostly just ranchers complaining about prices and weather." "Because those ranchers are our neighbors and potential customers," she replied, pinning her hat with practiced efficiency. "And because I want to understand the broader market we're operating in. Besides, you've been teaching me about cattle management. I should see how others approach it." The meeting was held in the back room of the saloon, a space that reeked of tobacco smoke and old whiskey. When Ethan and Lillian walked in together, the conversation stuttered to a halt. Women didn't typically attend these meetings. They were considered men's business. But Lillian held her head high and took a seat beside Ethan as if she had every right to be there. Marcus Doyle, who chaired the association, cleared his throat. "Cole, this is a cattlemen's meeting. Not sure it's appropriate for—" "My wife is as much a part of our ranch operation as I am," Ethan interrupted firmly. "More, in some ways. If there's business being discussed that affects our ranch, she has a right to hear it." Several men nodded agreement. Daniel Henderson spoke up. "Mrs. Cole's advice has helped my operation considerably. I'd welcome her perspective." Doyle looked like he wanted to argue, but the support in the room was clear. "Fine, let's get started." The meeting covered the usual topics: concerns about cattle prices, discussions of new breeding techniques, complaints about railroad shipping costs. But when the conversation turned to water rights and the ongoing tensions between ranchers and farmers over creek access, Lillian raised her hand. Doyle looked surprised, but nodded. "Mrs. Cole?" "I've been reviewing the territorial water laws," Lillian said, her voice clear and confident. "From what I understand, the current disputes are arising because there's no clear framework for shared access. Ranchers need water for cattle, farmers need it for irrigation, but there's no formal system for allocation during drought years." "That's the problem, yes," said one of the older ranchers. "But there's no solution. Water flows where it flows, can't change geography." "No, but you can create agreements," Lillian countered. Formal compacts between ranchers and farmers that establish priority access during different seasons, minimum flow guarantees, and dispute resolution procedures. I've drafted a preliminary framework that might serve as a starting point. She pulled papers from her bag and passed them around. Ethan watched the men read through her proposal, saw skepticism gradually shift to interest. She'd laid out a system that was fair, practical, and enforceable. Exactly what was needed. "This is actually quite sensible," Henderson said, looking up with respect. "Have you discussed this with the Farmers Cooperative?" "Not yet. I wanted to present it to this group first, since ranchers have historically been more resistant to formal agreements. But if there's interest, I'd be happy to arrange a joint meeting." By the end of the discussion, the association had voted to have Lillian represent them in negotiations with the farmers. It was unprecedented. A woman, an Easterner, and a relative newcomer speaking for established ranchers, but her competence was undeniable. As they walked back to the wagon afterward, Ethan shook his head in amazement. "You planned that, the whole thing." "I saw an opportunity," Lillian admitted. "Water rights will become more important as more people settle this territory. Getting ahead of the problem now builds goodwill and establishes us as leaders in the community. That has value beyond money." "You're thinking long-term." "Always." She smiled up at him. "We're not just surviving anymore, Ethan. We're building a legacy, something that will last beyond us." The thought sent a thrill through him. A legacy. A future that extended beyond the next payment, beyond the next crisis. A future they were creating together. March arrived with the first hints of spring, muddy roads, patches of brown grass emerging from melting snow, the occasional brave bird returning from winter migration. The final payment deadline loomed, but for the first time, Ethan felt no fear approaching it. They had the money. They'd had it for weeks, carefully set aside and protected against any emergency. On the morning of February 28th, the day before the deadline, Lillian sat at the kitchen table counting the money one final time. $300 exactly. Not a penny more, not a penny less. Every cent they'd managed to save beyond necessities had gone toward this moment. "We could pay it today," Ethan suggested. "Not wait until tomorrow." "No," Lillian said firmly. "Tomorrow is the deadline. We pay tomorrow. That shows we're meeting our obligations exactly as specified, not desperate to be done with it." She looked up at him with fierce pride. "We're going to walk into that bank on March 1st, hand Hammond the final payment, and watch him close out that loan. And we're going to do it with dignity." That night, they lay in bed talking about the future in ways they'd never quite dared before. What crops to plant in spring, whether to expand the cattle herd or focus on diversification. The possibility of buying back the northeast 40 acres they'd sold to Henderson, now that they could afford it. Dreams that had seemed impossible 6 months ago were now practical plans. "I want to expand the orchard," Lillian said. "Plant another 20 trees, apples and pears, but also cherries and plums. Diversify the fruit income." "That's a lot of work." "We're not afraid of work." She rolled to face him, her eyes bright with excitement. "And I want to start a proper vegetable operation. Not just potatoes, but everything. We could supply the restaurant year-round, preserve excess for winter sales. There's real money in that." "You've been thinking about this." "I've been dreaming about it," she corrected. "For months, I've been too focused on survival to let myself dream properly. But now," she placed her hand over his heart, "now I can dream. We can dream. About a ranch that doesn't just survive, but thrives. About a business that supports us and provides opportunities for others. About a life we build deliberately, not just one we stumble through." Ethan captured her hand, brought it to his lips. "Dream big, then. Because whatever you dream, we'll make it real. We've proven we can do anything when we work together." "Anything," she agreed, and kissed him with a passion that still amazed him, that this brilliant, determined woman had chosen him, had built a life with him, had turned a desperate arrangement into a true partnership. Morning came clear and cold, the first day of March. They dressed with care. Ethan in his good suit, Lillian in the blue dress she'd worn for their wedding. This was a formal occasion, an ending and a beginning all at once. The ride into Sterling Creek felt different from all the previous trips to the bank. There was no fear churning in Ethan's gut, no desperation clouding his thoughts. just satisfaction and pride. They'd done it. They'd saved the ranch through intelligence, hard work, and unwavering partnership. Other ranchers called out greetings as they passed. Several people stopped them on the street to exchange pleasantries. The transformation in how the town viewed them was remarkable. They'd gone from objects of curiosity and doubt to respected members of the community. Lillian had earned that respect through her competence and willingness to help others. Ethan had earned it by standing beside her and proving that partnership could achieve what stubbornness alone could not. Timothy the clerk actually smiled when they entered the bank. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole, good morning. I'll let Mr. Hammond know you're here." They waited in the lobby, and Ethan noticed Lillian's hand was steady when she held the money envelope. No trembling, no anxiety, just calm certainty. Hammond appeared at the top of the stairs. "Come up, please." His office looked the same. Massive desk, papers everywhere, the smell of pipe tobacco and old leather. But Hammond himself seemed different, less predatory, more respectful. "Well," he said as they sat down, "here we are. March 1st. Final payment due." He looked at them expectantly. Lillian placed the envelope on his desk. $300, as agreed. This completes our obligation." Hammond opened the envelope and counted the money with his usual meticulous care. When he finished, he sat back and actually smiled, a real smile, not his usual calculating expression. $300 exactly. Outstanding. He pulled out the loan documents and began making notations. The Cole Ranch loan, opened June 1869, balance due as of today, $300, received in full cash payment on March 1st, 1873. He stamped several documents with force, the sound echoing in the quiet office. Paid in full. Loan closed. The words seemed to hang in the air. Paid in full. Loan closed. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like without it. Hammond pulled out fresh papers and wrote out a document in his careful script. "This is your receipt and loan closure notification. Keep it somewhere safe. This certifies that the First Bank of Sterling Creek holds no further claim against your property." He stood and extended his hand to Lillian first. "Mrs. Cole, when you first walked into this office 6 months ago with your business plan and your confidence, I thought you were either brilliant or delusional. I'm pleased to say you've proven to be brilliant. What you two have accomplished is genuinely remarkable." "Thank you, Mr. Hammond." Lillian shook his hand firmly. "Your willingness to give us a chance made it possible. I gave you rope. You could have hanged yourselves with it. Instead, you climbed to safety." He turned to Ethan. "Cole, your father was a good man, but he was stuck in old ways. You've had the wisdom to embrace new approaches. That's what survival requires in changing times. I'm glad to see the ranch will remain in your family." They walked out of the bank into the March sunshine, and Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. Lillian's hand found his, squeezed tight, and when he looked at her, he saw tears on her cheeks. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "We did," he confirmed, and pulled her into an embrace right there on the street, not caring who saw. "The ranch is ours, free and clear." They celebrated with lunch at the restaurant again, toasting their success with coffee since neither of them drank spirits. Mrs. Franklin stopped by their table to congratulate them. Word had already spread through town about the paid-off loan. Other townsfolk did the same, offering genuine happiness for their success. "You two have given this town something to be proud of," Pastor Reynolds said, pausing on his way out. "A story about people who refused to quit, who found success through partnership and determination. That's worth more than money." As they drove home that afternoon, Ethan felt like he was seeing the ranch with new eyes. This wasn't just the land his father had claimed and his mother had preserved. This was his land, his and Lillian's together, the place where they'd fought and struggled and ultimately triumphed. Every fence they'd repaired, every building they'd restored, every crop they'd planted, all of it was theirs now, truly theirs, with no bank holding power over them. "What are you thinking?" Lillian asked as they pulled up to the house. "That this place looks different when it's actually yours, when you're not just fighting to keep it, but building something for the future." "Our future," she said softly. "Everything we do now is for us, for the life we're creating." They spent the evening not working. For the first time in 6 months, they gave themselves permission to simply rest and enjoy what they'd accomplished. They sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun set over the prairie and talking about dreams that were no longer desperate wishes but actual plans. "I want to teach," Lillian said suddenly. "Not full-time, but I could help other ranch wives with bookkeeping, with business management. So many of them are struggling the way we were, and they don't have to. You'd be good at that. And I want us to hire help. Not immediately, but soon. We've proven we can run this ranch efficiently, but we don't have to do everything ourselves anymore. Hiring a hand or two would free us to focus on expansion and improvement rather than just maintenance." "I like that idea." Ethan pulled her closer against the evening chill. "And I want to restore the orchard properly, like you said. Make it something my mother would have been proud of. She loved those trees. Then we'll make them thrive, for her memory and for our future." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Ethan thought about the journey they'd traveled, from desperate strangers to partners to lovers to this moment of peace and possibility. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments when failure seemed certain, when the weight of it all felt crushing, but they'd persevered together, and that partnership had made all the difference. "Ethan," Lillian said quietly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't answered your advertisement, if I'd stayed in Boston or gone somewhere else?" "Sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep. What do you think would have happened?" He considered the question seriously. "I think the bank would have foreclosed. I think I would have lost everything and ended up working someone else's land. I was too stubborn to see what needed to change, too proud to ask for help, too trapped in doing things the way they'd always been done." He looked at her. "You saved me, Lillian. The ranch, yes, but also me. You showed me that asking for help isn't weakness, that changing approach isn't giving up, that partnership is stronger than solitary struggle." "You saved me too," she replied. "I was drowning in Boston, defined by my father's scandal, trapped in a life that had no future. You gave me a chance to prove myself, to build something real, to be valued for my abilities rather than judged for circumstances beyond my control." She turned to face him fully. "We saved each other, Ethan. That's what makes this work. We're not dependent on each other out of weakness. We're stronger together because each of us brings something the other needs." "Perfect partnership." "Perfect partnership," she agreed. The weeks after paying off the loan felt like emerging from a long tunnel into daylight. With the constant pressure of debt removed, they could focus on improvement rather than survival. They hired a young man named James Miller, the son of a neighboring farmer, to help with daily operations. His wages were manageable now that they had steady income, and his assistance freed them to pursue larger goals. Lillian established her teaching program, meeting with ranch wives every Tuesday afternoon in the church hall. She taught basic bookkeeping, resource management, and negotiating skills. The women who attended were grateful. Most had been raised to manage households but not to understand business, and Lillian's practical approach demystified concepts that had seemed impenetrable. "You're changing lives," Ethan observed after one particularly well-attended session. "I'm sharing what I was lucky enough to learn," Lillian corrected. "My father taught me these skills because he believed women should understand business. Not every woman had that advantage. If I can help them gain that knowledge now, it strengthens everyone." The water rights negotiations she'd initiated bore fruit in early April. Ranchers and farmers signed a historic compact establishing clear guidelines for water allocation, dispute resolution, and conservation measures. Lillian's framework became the model, and her role in creating it elevated her status in the community even further. She was no longer just Cole's mail-order bride, or even that clever woman from Boston. She was Mrs. Lillian Cole, respected businesswoman and community leader. Spring arrived in full force by late April, and Ethan took Lillian out to see the prairie in bloom. Wildflowers covered the landscape in waves of color: purple lupine, yellow sunflowers, red Indian paintbrush, white prairie clover. She stood in the midst of it all, turning slowly to take in the view, and her face showed pure wonder. "This," she said, "this is what I dreamed about in Boston. Not specifically this place, but the feeling of it. Open space, possibility,
Beauty that exists just because it exists, not because someone designed it for fashion or propriety. You belong here, Ethan said with certainty. I knew it that first day, even when I was terrified you'd leave. You looked at this land with interest instead of disappointment. That told me everything. I belong with you, she corrected, coming to his side. The land is beautiful, but it's you who made it home. They stood together looking out over their ranch, their land, free and clear, full of potential they were only beginning to realize. The wheat fields showed green shoots emerging. The orchard trees were flowering, promising a good harvest. The cattle grazed peacefully. The buildings stood straight and sound. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd built, spread out before them like a promise made real. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, Lillian confessed. That I'm here, that we made it, that everything turned out better than I dared hope. It's real, Ethan assured her. All of it. And it's just the beginning. She leaned against him, and they watched the wind move through the grass in patterns that looked like waves on an ocean. Tell me about our future, she said. What do you see when you look ahead? I see this ranch thriving. I see orchards full of fruit and fields full of crops. I see cattle healthy and strong. I see buildings we've built and improvements we've made. He paused, gathered courage. I see children running through those fields, teaching them what we know, letting them grow up with this land the way I did, but with better tools and more knowledge. Lillian was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I see that too. I see a family, a real home, a legacy that matters. I see us growing old together, watching seasons change, building something that lasts beyond us. Is that what you want? It's exactly what I want. She turned to look up at him. I came here for a fresh start, for purpose, for a chance to prove myself. I found all that. But I also found love, partnership, and a home in ways I never imagined. This life we're building, it's more than I dreamed possible. Ethan kissed her there in the spring sunshine, surrounded by wildflowers and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. We should get back, Lillian said, though she made no move to leave. There's always work to do. There is, but it can wait another few minutes. He held her close, breathing in the scent of prairie flowers and the soap she used, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. I want to remember this moment. Standing here with you, everything behind us conquered, everything ahead of us full of promise. I'll remember it, she promised. Every detail. This is the moment when everything changed from surviving to living. They returned to the ranch hand in hand, ready to continue the work that was no longer burden but joy. James had finished the morning feeding and was starting on fence repairs. The chickens were laying well. The garden they'd planted was showing its first shoots. Everything was as it should be, productive, organized, full of life. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Ethan looked across the table at his wife and marveled at how much had changed in less than a year. The woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in August, elegant and uncertain, had transformed into someone who moved through ranch life with confidence and grace. Her hands were roughened by work, her face was sun-touched, her dresses were practical rather than fashionable. But her eyes held a contentment that he suspected had been missing before. What? She asked, catching his stare. Just thinking about how far we've come. We've come very far. She reached across the table to take his hand. And we have so much further to go. But Ethan, whatever comes, drought or prosperity, hardship or ease, I know we'll face it together. That's what makes everything possible. Together, he agreed. Always together. As night fell and they prepared for bed, Ethan realized that somewhere in the struggle and triumph of the past months, they'd built more than a successful ranch. They'd built a marriage based on mutual respect, genuine partnership, and deep love. They'd proven that two desperate people taking a chance on each other could create something extraordinary. The mail-order bride who'd arrived with hidden talents had saved more than a struggling ranch. She'd saved a man who'd been drowning in isolation and stubbornness. She'd shown him that asking for help wasn't weakness, that change wasn't betrayal, that love could grow in the most unexpected circumstances. And Ethan, in turn, had given Lillian something equally precious, a place to belong, a purpose that mattered.
and a partnership where her abilities were valued rather than questioned. Together, they'd created a life neither could have built alone. 6 months later, on a golden October afternoon, Ethan stood on the porch watching Lillian in the orchard. She was checking the apple trees, making notes in the ledger she always carried, planning next year's expansion. The setting sun caught her hair, turning it to dark fire, and he felt that familiar surge of love and gratitude. She looked up, caught him watching, and waved. He waved back and she started toward the house, her stride confident and purposeful. This was home. This was family. This was the future they'd built from desperation and determination and love. When she reached the porch, slightly breathless from the walk, she smiled up at him with such joy that his heart squeezed. "The trees look perfect," she announced. "Next year's harvest will be even better than this year's. I've been doing calculations, and if we expand as planned—" He silenced her with a kiss, and when he pulled back, she was laughing. "What was that for?" "For being you. For coming here, for staying, for building this life with me. For being the best partner and wife I could have imagined." "Ethan Cole," she said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You're getting sentimental." "Maybe, but it's true. All of it." She wrapped her arms around him, and they stood together on the porch of the house that was truly theirs, looking out at the land they'd saved and the future they'd created. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The windmill turned lazily, pumping water for crops and livestock. The orchard rustled in the evening breeze. Everything was exactly as it should be. "I love you," Lillian said simply. "I love you too," Ethan replied. "Now and always." They stood there as the sun set over the Nebraska prairie, two people who'd found each other in desperation and built something extraordinary in partnership. The ranch was saved, the debt was paid, and the future stretched ahead full of possibility. The mail-order bride had arrived with hidden talents and had transformed not just a failing ranch, but 2 lives. What had started as a desperate gamble had become the foundation of a legacy, a ranch that would thrive for generations, built on the partnership of 2 people who dared to trust each other when trust seemed impossible. Together, they'd proven that the strongest foundations were built not on certainty, but on commitment, that the best marriages were partnerships of equals, that love could grow even in the hardest soil if tended with care and honesty. And as they walked into their home, side by side, they carried with them the certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them as they faced everything, together, as partners, as lovers, as equals, building a life deliberately chosen and carefully crafted. The ranch was more than saved. It was thriving, and so were they.